الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا وحبيبنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. So we're looking at this particular article, which is on your screen, and which hopefully you will be able to read on your own time. It's on the hanbali.com website. Inshallah, Dr. Salim, if he hasn't already, hopefully he'll send you a link to this article somehow, inshallah. And so take your time, in your own time, you can read it. I wrote it recently, Kalam and the Hanbalis, is it really relevant today? It's coming from the angle that we in Northern Europe, the West, North America included, Canada, United States, we see a lot of Muslims, especially, young, intelligent Muslim men and women, and it's not just young, it can be elders as well, who get highly confused with the kind of rational secular discourses that they learn at college and university, and trying to square it with Islam. The big culprits tend to be the theory of evolution that tends to blow a lot of people's iman out of the water, as had historically happened in Europe, in Britain, when Darwin first proposed his ideas of evolution, and he wrote his famous book, The Origin of Species. It shook a lot of people's faith, more than Galileo telling us that perhaps, the earth isn't the center of everything, more than finding out that, that the sun and the planets don't revolve around the earth, more than any paradigm shift, scientific or philosophical paradigm shift, evolution became that thing that really was a sledgehammer in many people's faith, and it continues to be so today. And there are other issues as well. Secularism in its general form, you have ideas of feminism, some issues of genderism, all of those pose philosophical problems. Just give me a second. I'm just going to answer this door. Sorry about that. So there have been challenges, and now these challenges aren't actually localized to the West. They're all around the globe. Those whom we call Muslim modernists, or the modernist movement in Islam, rightly or wrongly, in the early part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, they tried to tackle some of these issues, some more successful than others, some really missed the mark, some got the mark in terms of some basic foundations, but couldn't build upon that. So it's not an entirely new thing. The difference is today is that these ideas that challenge Islamic beliefs or normative Islamic practices have become widespread through society. Once upon a time, in the subcontinent, it would have generally been the elite, well-read, well-educated Muslims who probably, some of them might have studied in the West, some of the ulama who would have known these ideas and either tried to tackle them or just ignore them. Or in the case of Muslim modernists, try to say, look, this is the way we square the circle with modernity and Islam. But the masses wouldn't have been touched by this. And to a large degree, that was the same in the West as well. But slowly and steadily, these ideas, through mass media, through mass reading, through mass literacy, through obligatory education, state education, it's only been in the late 1800s since the United Kingdom, Britain, made it compulsory. The state made it compulsory for people to go to school. Otherwise, historically, for nearly 1,000 years, the church and the local communities, the local villages, under the guidance of the local church, would have taken the responsibility for education. but there was a reason why we have state education in modern countries. And the main reason, whatever other reasons there is, the main reason is someone had to work in the factories, someone had to work the machines in industry, someone had to keep the machine going, so to speak, and therefore mass literacy to a level was required. And the only way anyone could enforce that is if the state had its hand. And so it wasn't learning for the sake of wisdom and knowledge, it was functional learning. You learn enough to function in society, but not really become wise and learned. And to a large degree, that's still the case today throughout the world. Anyway, so given that, I wrote this piece, Kalam, and then I put in the Hanbali school, because there's a lot of confusion even amongst people who wish to ascribe to the Hanbali school of fiqh about what the Hanbali kalam stance is. And then the question is kalam, and the kind of issues that were raised by the classical Muslim theologians. Is it all relevant today? And the only way we can make a sound decision about this question, kalam and the Hanbalis, is it relevant today, is by first understanding what kalam is, what it was there for, what was it meant to do, what is it meant to do, and then we can ask the question: is it really relevant today? And I think that's one of the big problems, I think, in leaving alone other people's education, but in modern Muslim education, quite often we don't really try to understand the issues thoroughly before grappling with them. And there is no shame, neither from a religious angle, from a Sharia angle, nor from just a rational, akali angle. There's no shame in looking at some issue or some topic or some theme and thinking about it for weeks, months, even years, without actually making a specific pronouncement or judgment on it, because really maybe one hasn't yet fully understood it. There's no shame. I mean, obviously you can't do that in every issue, otherwise we would be just dysfunctional Muslims. And likewise, we couldn't do that with every secular science. You know, if the biologists and the virologists and the chemists and all these other people in the field of medicine decided, well, let's just do a 10-year trial with COVID, which is, you know, like the normal 10, 15-year trial that vaccines and these kind of medicines go through, instead of innovating new ways to speed up the process, we hope, inshallah, and just say, well, we'll wait 10, 15 years. I mean, obviously, it's possible that half the world wouldn't be around. So in some issues, we have to just go for it and do whatever we can with as many checks and measures as possible. And in other cases, like philosophical abstract issues, we don't have to immediately say anything. Okay, so we've gone through the first part of this article. I've actually been reading from it for the last 2 weeks, or referring to it. The beginning introduction just tells us the words that we're using. Discursive theology is really the Sunni ilm al-kalam. Speculative theology is really the philosophers' ilm al-kalam. Discursive theology is where aql, the intellect and rational principles, are used to defend the Sunni creed, the Sunni aqidah. And speculative theology, which doesn't take the aqidah from the Quran and the Sunnah and the ijma, the scholarly consensus, it doesn't take it as first principles. It makes up its own first principles in the light of Greek rational principles. And then I said that we're going to discuss 4 issues: the position of kalam in Sunni Islam. We covered that last week, and now today the Hanbali position concerning it. And then 3 and 4, it's the pros and cons of kalam, and as you can see in number 4, its relevance, if any, today. And then I quickly said kalam literally means speech, actually meant speech about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using reason-based proofs. okay, using reason-based proofs and rational arguments. And then we said that the first people to introduce kalam from the kind of angle of making it religious were the Mu'tazila, an early Muslim sect. Generally, all of the, as they say, all of the 72 sects in Islam, or the 6 main ones, okay, all of them as a rule of thumb are Muslim. Whether we're talking about Mu'tazila, whether we're talking about the Shia, whether we're talking about the Qadariya, whether we're talking about the Jabariya or the Murjiya or the Khawarij, on the whole, they are considered to be Muslim deviant sects. Individuals from amongst them may have left the fold of Islam. Individual beliefs may be outside of the realm of Islam. Instead of being deviant, Islamically deviant, they may be outside of Islam. But on the whole, bil jumla, historically, these innovated sects, the sects of Ahlul Bid'ah, are considered Muslims, but misguided Muslims. In the Akhirah, every Muslim, regardless of what sin he or she has, whether it's a sin in action or whether it's a sin in beliefs that don't take a person outside of Islam, eventually after being purified, Allah forbid, in hellfire or whatever it be, if they don't have intercession or if they don't have good deeds that outweigh their bad deeds and so on and so forth, eventually every Muslim goes to paradise. In this world, though, we don't say, oh, mashallah, Mu'tazilis will go to paradise, the Khawarij will go to paradise. Whether that, even though we hold that to be true, in this world, we have an Islamic obligation to correct falsehood, to correct things that are falsehood, clearly wrong, misguidance, deviancy. So our job in this world is correction. And Allah's mercy is that every Muslim, regardless of what sect they were within Islam, will eventually make their way to paradise by Allah's mercy. But Ahl Sunnah are considered the saved sect because it is the path that was trodden upon by the Prophet ﷺ and his companions and those who followed them. And if you want to know how do all of these other sects differ from the saved sect Ahl Sunnah, then rather than go through individual beliefs of these other sects, it's enough to say 2 things. That every one of these sects, Mu'tazilite, Khawarij, Shia, have a negative opinion about a group, a large group, or all of the companions. Mainstream Shiaism has a huge problem with the vast majority of companions, barring a handful. The Khawarij had a huge problem with Ali radiallahu anhu and others like him. In fact, they declared him to be a kafir, barring a handful of them. The Mu'tazilites had a huge problem with like half of the companions, or more than half of the companions, and they were kind of okay-ish with the rest of them. All of them have a problem with the Sahaba as a whole. And what follows from that is that they don't take the ijma, the collective agreement of the Sahaba, or the collective agreement of the scholars from the Sahaba, as a binding proof in law or theology, in fiqh or aqidah. Okay, and then from there, they differ in the misguidance that they have in terms of their beliefs and their understanding. Okay, so as soon as someone says, well, you know what, I have some issue with some of the Sahaba, not to say that, oh, this Sahabi was wrong, this Sahabi was right. No, that can be said with respect. But, oh, I don't believe that they were true Muslims, or I don't believe that they were pious, or I don't believe that they were rightly guided. Khalas, even without discussing anything more from that individual, you know that that individual is saying words of misguidance. And if that is what he or she truly believes in their heart, is on a path of misguidance at the moment. We may not have to shun them. We may not have to, be harsh to them. We may be able to reason with them. We may be able to patiently over weeks or months discuss with them, debate with them, dialogue with them for hopefully for them to change their views. But the view is misguidance. The view is misguidance. So we're not looking for people who beautify their speech with lovely words. Okay, you will find that amongst any and every religion. Religions that don't even believe in Allah can write and speak beautifully about what they believe to be true. So we're not interested in beautiful speech. Oh, wow, so lovely. The poetic Urdu, the Farsi eloquence, the Arabic language. Oh, mashallah. I'm not interested in that rhetoric. We're first interested in, is the speech correct? And does it accord to the truth of revelation? And then secondly, if it happens to be beautiful, then Bismillah, that's a bonus. That's a bonus. So we need to be very clear on that. Let me not be too long on this. So point 2 was that I gave a few sayings of the early Imams, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, Imam Abu Yusuf, about their stiff opposition, their fierce opposition to kalam. In their time, really no one was practicing kalam except the Mu'tazilites. We're talking about kalam in aqidah, kalam in theology. No one was using rational proofs in theological issues except the Mu'tazilites, and they ended up differing in some issues with these great Imams of the Salaf. And so there was no other way but to be very strict against them, very stern against them. And you have lots of sayings. However, we looked at point 3, which said, and this is something that a lot of people are not aware of. It's not enough that we take arguments that are for us. We need to also listen to arguments that may seemingly be against us. And we cannot just ignore them, especially when they come from the same sources or from the same person. So Imam al-Shafi'i has really harsh statements against the Ahlul Kalam. But we saw in point 3, likewise, he has positive statements that seem to be positing or advocating a Sunni type of kalam. And so we can't just dismiss that, oh, Imam Shafi said kalam is all bid'ah and it's a heresy. Yeah, he did say that, but he also said something else, and it's not from justice or fairness, or even religion for that matter, just to take one saying and ignore another saying. We did also see that Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, okay, in point, I think it was in point 4 or 5, somewhere we saw Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal deny Sunni kalam as well. He has some harsh words against Sunni kalam. So if anything, we know that Imam Shafi had the kind of, he understood and accepted something of Sunni rational theology. But from what we've seen of Imam Ahmad thus far in our discussion, he seems to be against it all. And you know the history, and many of you know the history of the Hanafi school in terms of kalam and in terms of rational underpinnings, that at some point it became an acceptable part of the Hanafis in terms of their theology to take kalam into consideration. And in fact, independently, the scholars who were Hanafi in fiqh, independently to the mainstream Islamic world, which centered around Baghdad, these Hanafi scholars then delved into theology, aqidah, and developed a Sunni form of kalam, which arose independently from the kind of Sunni kalam that was going on in the capital of the Muslim world, in Baghdad, headed by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, and what was then to be called by the 5th century, the Ash'ari school, by the late 400s, or by the early 400s, the Ash'ari school. And then you had the Hanafi school of theology, which was called the Maturidi school, after Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. And where did we get there? Point 5, we got to the point where it was, well, from the 5th century, from, like, say, just before al-Ghazali's time, by the time Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Imam al-Maturidi made their mark in the Muslim world and in Islamic history, we understood, or the majority of Muslim scholars understood, that there is a praiseworthy type of kalam, al-kalam al-mamduh, and a blameworthy type of kalam, al-kalam al-madhmoom. Okay, that was what we did in point 5. And I mentioned that the Malikis, the Hanafis, the Shafi'is, all of them accepted more or less the praiseworthy type of kalam. It was only the Hanbalis, okay, that it wasn't, they didn't have one agreed upon opinion about kalam, which is what we're going to discuss today. It ranged from total rejection of kalam to a pretty much overall acceptance of kalam, with some in between. We'll dabble with kalam a little bit, but not too much. And all three positions were positions taken, especially the first two, by the relied upon scholars of the Hanbali school. When those Hanbalis took kalam into consideration, that ended up being called either Salafi Aqidah or Athari Aqidah or Hanbali Aqidah. The Hanbali school has an odd distinction that if you look in the classical literature, you find the word Hanbali can mean a school of fiqh. Hanbali can mean a school of theology, Aqidah. And Hanbali can mean a school of tasawwuf, a school of suluk, of tazkiyatun nafs, of Sufism, which no other school has. I mean, the Hanafi school is khalas, just a school of fiqh, and the theology arm is Maturidi. The Malikis and the Shafis, different two schools of fiqh, and their theology arm is Ash'arism. Okay, but the Hanbalis, they have Hanbali in fiqh and Hanbali in Aqidah, which is the same as Salafi, but not Salafi as in the modern day Salafi movement, or sometimes called Athari, which roughly means the same thing. Okay, and the final point we got to, the final 2 points, that those who used ilmul kalam, what was their reason? So let me just read this bit as a recap. Those who employed ilmul kalam contended that in order to confront the arguments of various non-Muslims in the vastly expanding empire and to engage with the polemics challenging orthodoxy over the nature of divinity and faith, the rationalizing methods of the heterodox sects, like the philosophers and the Mu'tazilites, needed to be used so as to rebut those people on their own turf. And then we read this lovely short statement from Ibn Khaldun, rahmatullah alayh, who says that kalam is what? Kalam is the science which involves arguing in defense of the articles of faith by using rational proofs in refuting the innovators who have deviated in their belief from the beliefs of the Salaf and Ahl Sunnah. And I said that perhaps a middle position, a balanced position, should be something what Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the famous Shafi'i faqih and scholar of hadith, he says, so fortunate is the one who clings to what the Salaf were upon and avoid what the latecomers innovated. But if he cannot, then let him take from it, meaning take from kalam, only that which is required, but let the original way be his intended goal. I'm going to take kalam to defend the aqidah of the Salaf, but it is the Salaf, the way of the Salaf and their creed, their aqidah, their theology, which is the goal to be defended. Okay, so that really recaps 2 weeks worth of discussion. Can we move on, Dr. Salim? Or is there any questions at this point?
Any questions, inshallah?
Silence is golden. Shall we carry on?
Definitely. There is a question there. Let me just have a quick look.
Oh, okay.
When you said, see that, so how much importance is given to the hadith regarding 73 sects? Did any scholar consider the number 73 to be insignificant, inaccurate? I have old scholars sect said this number is significant and precise in describing the number of sects that will emerge.
Okay. So that's a very easy answer. Whenever you find the word 7 or 70 in the Quran or in the Hadiths, then sometimes it's literally that 7 or 70, you know, and there is no difference of opinion amongst the scholars, such as the 7 heavens. Okay, you don't find people, any scholar saying, oh, there's more than 7 heavens. And sometimes when the word 7 or 70 or the likes of 70, like 73 comes along, scholars differ, and some scholars taking the literal number 7 or 70 and other scholars saying the word means many. And in classical Arabic language, the word 70 or 700 can mean many, but they can also mean the number. So there is no agreed upon opinion amongst the scholars. The scholars are differ about this hadith, which mentions 73 sects. Does it literally mean 73, or does it mean many? Scholars differ, and in reality, there is no great benefit arguing about this or becoming dogmatic. All we know is that there will be a lot of innovations, and many of those innovations and deviancies will be in matters of belief that happened from early on in Islam. And whether they form 72 other sects or whether they form many sects, but not quite 70, it's really not a big issue. That's how scholars take it. However, some scholars, like, for example, Ibn al-Jawzi from the Hanbalis, in one of his books, went out of the way to divide the 6 main groups, the 6 main innovated sects, into a further 12 divisions, thus making 72 in all. But that's just ijtihadi. That's not like from revelation, and scholars can differ how you divide a group or not divide a group. Is that okay?
Definitely. Shaykh, what about the sects of Alawites, Ismailis, and Qadianis?
This hadith about the 72 sects is referring to وَسَتَفْتَرِكُ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ عَلَى 73 فرقة إلى آخر الحديث. My ummah, my Muslim ummah, the Prophet said. Because what did he say before? The Jews split up into 71 sects, the Christians into 72, and my ummah. So when we talk about any of these 72 sects, we are talking about Muslims. As regards to the 2 sects that you mentioned, then they are not Muslim sects. They are just sects who ascribe to Islam, but their ascription doesn't prove that they're Muslim or not.
Jazakallah khairan.
Barakallah fikum.
Then Brother Balahat.
So just one caveat. How one deals with deviant Muslim groups, or even non-Muslims who think that they are ascribed to Islam in a Muslim majority country, is in the modern age a very complex, difficult issue to deal with, and it is not part of our discussion at all.
Barakallah fi. Brother Malahat, please go on.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. I have two questions. I can try to combine and see if you can able to answer it. Modernity. So we always, the Muslims, and in general, like majority of the Muslims, we have this negative connotation towards the concept of secularism and modernity. Like even for the Urdu translation of secular is la diniyat, right? So that's so you know,
is that the standard translation of secularism in Urdu? La diniyat.
Best of my knowledge, yes.
So do they not use in Urdu ilmaniya or ilmani like the Arabs use?
Salim bhai know better Urdu than I do, but
Mashallah. I like that. They just poof, no deen.
So
anti-religiousness.
Right. So that's something, you know, because another class we're reading the Talal Asad text, the formation of the secular Islam and modernity. And so he mentioned about the John Rawls and all those guys and the Charles access about it. So that's one of the questions that, you know, how that negative connotation, because we are impacted of the modernity in our daily life. Like I just see like some of all of our walls, we have those Islamic categories, right? So is yesterday we talked about it. One of the wall we have a flower. Second of the wall we have a painting. Third of the wall we have a Ayatul Kursi or the Quds, right? So even we use the Islamic text without feeling, we just feel the barakah out of it rather than getting the practical advice out of the Quran and the Sunnah. So that's one of the challenge. Second, you mentioned about the youth and the challenges about the youth, about the I forgot the terminology.
Don't worry about the terminology.
Yeah. So, but you know, you just mentioned it earlier. This just came into my mind. So, I mean, those are the challenges of our next generation, which is the Western generation of Muslims. And they are getting impacted and influenced of those negativity. And they are trying to be, I'm just afraid that we are not generating like a hypocrites in our families, which is actually, they have a one face towards us as a parents and social pressure of the Muslims. And the other side, they are getting severely impacted by those negativity of the society and the social impact. Sorry for the long question, but
no, it's a brilliant question. In fact, your question sums up the whole reason why we here and elsewhere around the world, we're trying to grapple with some of these philosophical, rational concepts and see what we can make of it. It's precisely because of the questions you have asked. But your question with all their sub-questions can't be answered all in one go, other than to say, you know, I mean, the thing about not generating hypocritical Muslims, I mean, that's, you know, there's no short answer to that. You know, are we just kind of, you know, are we just superficially attached to Quran and Sunnah? There's no one specific answer to that. But secularism, however, la dinia, or however they say it in Urdu, I suspect this word la dini or la dinia for secularism must have been something that was evolved very early on, when they just looked at the natija, the consequence of secularism, which was that a lot of people early on in the subcontinent seem to have lost their faith, and therefore secularism equates with not being religious. And that might have been okay then, but to say that secularism is anti-religion, that's not really the full story. Even if one were to say that, you know what, so secularism by its nature erodes away religion, erodes Iman, which is very true. It's not clearly anti-Iman, which is why in the secular West, the secular West doesn't fight against religion openly, but secularism in China, communism in this case, okay, which is a secular theology, fights against religion. Okay, so it depends on what type of secularism, or let's be realistic as well. Just take in the West, the three most famous countries in the West in terms of Western: the United States, Britain, and France. Secularism in the United States is very different is slightly different to that in Britain and France. In America, this just gives you an ala sabil mithal, misal ke taur par, it kind of gives you how maybe we need to just be careful of having one blanket statement about secularism. In ilm, we like to have tafsil, we like to have detail and shades of gray. Okay, and secularism has some tafsil. So for example, in America, if you're running for presidency, if you're running for the highest office and you somehow say, I'm an atheist, you will never get elected to office. You will never get elected to office. In Britain and France, if you're running for the highest office, prime ministership in the UK, presidentship in France, and you say, I believe in God, and I'm whatever, you will never get elected to office. Which is why the former prime minister, Tony Blair, he had to wait until he is no longer prime minister to openly announce to the world that he has accepted the Catholic religion. But whilst he was prime minister, it was very difficult for him to do, because the country doesn't like politicians to be openly aligned with religion, even if in their personal life they have religion. And in France, forget about openly, in the public space, whilst in Britain, I can wear if I'm a Sikh, I can wear a turban. If I'm a Christian, I can wear a cross. If I'm a Muslim, I can wear a hijab, even a niqab. I can show religious symbolism in the public sphere, not just at home, in the public sphere. In France, you can't do that. So France has a secularism which is in the public space. It has no room for religion. You do religion in your temple, in your home, in your mind, in your heart, but you don't do it in the public space. America, God save America, God save this, God save that, God's on our side in war. If you don't invoke God, it's really hard to climb up the political ladder in the United States. That might change, that is changing. And in Britain, it's like kind of a little bit of both. And that's secularism. Three different, distinct types of secularism, but it's secularism. One is clearly in the public space, France, anti-religious, but not anti-religious in principle. But it's do your religion in the temple, as opposed to China, no religion at all.
Yeah, I think that you just summed up. I think that Charles something
Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor.
He said the France is the secular society and secular government. British is the people is not secular. They're more like religious, but the government wants to be a secular. In America, is the other way around. The people are secular, but the government is not. So, mashallah, this is exactly.
Yeah. And so all we need to do is not blame people, scholars or thinkers of the past. All we have to do is, whatever they've given us, we have to see, is it suitable? Is it still valid? And if not, then we change it or we tweak it. So this La Dinia is probably, I don't know how helpful it's going to be in Pakistan or not, for example, because in one sense, it does portray the end consequences of a hardcore secularism. It does erode faith at some level. That doesn't mean every secular person becomes a kafir, but it does impact faith, as we all know. But on the other hand, it does give a very misrepresentation of what secularism is. Secularism is not saying there is no church. Secularism is saying there is a separation between state and church, between politics and religion. It's not saying no religion, it's saying a separation, that religious ideas and religious values should not influence state or political decisions, even if the individuals are themselves religious. If you want to argue for the banning of alcohol in a secular state, you can't say because Allah says so in the Quran. You have to argue it based upon rational principles that, you know, medically, do you know how much the NHS spends millions of pounds a year dealing with alcohol abuse? And you can argue it that way, but you can't say, oh, because it says so in the Quran or somewhere, wherever. That's secularism. So shall we move on?
Barakallah fi Shaykh. One quick point from Maulana Hanbali, inshallah.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Alaikum
I
assalam.
wanted to ask another question, and I will go to that question. When you mentioned that when we say Hanabila in Mutakallimin, that means specific, a separate section of Mutakallimin from Ahlus Sunnah, and likewise when we say in fiqh, it means another. It means there is a special group of people. But when we say Shafi'i in Mutakallimin, we say Ash'arites or Maturidiyya. Why? What is the reason that the Shafi'is or Ahnaf they are named with Ash'arites or Maturidiyyas in Ilmul Kalam, but not Hanabila? What is the reason? Sorry if I missed that part.
Yeah, no. What is the reason? Historically, wallahu, I don't know what is the reason. I think largely it was to do with Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. His story is a very dramatic story.
Yes.
And his U-turn from Mu'tazilite, being a Mu'tazilite, to being a Sunni, what became so well known amongst the scholars and even society. And then the number of booklets he had written and books. Apparently he wrote over 70 or 80 books. I mean, most of them haven't survived. And so all you could hear is Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari is debating the Mu'tazilites Saturday night, Sunday night he's debating these people, Monday night he's doing this. And so I think just his charismatic personality made his ideas take on his name. And I'm assuming that something like that must have happened with Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. But the strange thing is we don't have it, from what I know, we don't have much of a biography of him. But wallahu alim, what the actual reason was, these are just speculations from my side. I don't know why. Yeah, wallahu alim, unless someone amongst you have read something else, inshallah, that you'd like to share with us, inshallah.
If your brother wants to say something about that, otherwise we'll move on, inshallah.
Okay, this brings me to another point. I actually prefer discussions and just exploring things, as long as we don't lose sight of the main material. I'm kind of a, Dr. Salim might tell you, I don't have any desire to finish a particular text. So if I'm doing the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, yes, it's quite important to finish the book, but I won't finish the book if it means I'm racing through the material just for the sake of finishing it on a deadline, because it defeats the point. If we only learned 30 hadith, but we learned it well, we would be far better for our Iman and our relationship with Allah and our Islam than learning 40 hadith, but not well. Likewise, there is no particular course when it comes to Ilm al-Kalam per se. You have your own reasons for discussing this. Some of those reasons are similar to my reasons. Some of them are unique to your circumstance and situation. Some of you, if not all of you, have a focus, even if you live here, on what's going on in Pakistan. That's not my focus for some obvious reasons. And each country tends to have its very unique setup and sociology. So I'm happy with, if you just want to just raise your hands for the question, I don't mind. But whilst there's no questions currently, let's move on to just the Hanbalis and Kalam, just so that we get an overall view of what is the Sunni take on Kalam, even though we know the Malikis, the Shafis, and the Hanafis have generally accepted Kalam. So we can quite confidently say most of the Hanafi scholars agreed to be in Maturidi, except a few who disagreed with Kalam. All of the Maliki major scholars agreed to theology and be a Kalam and be Ashari, apart from perhaps 2 or maybe 3 mega imams. Otherwise, you can really say just all of the Maliki. And most of the Shafi'is agreed to be Ashari, barring a handful, who then followed the Athari creed. Okay, but the Hanbalis, well, point 8. Of all scholarly groupings, here we are, of all scholarly groupings, the outright rejection of Kalam is usually associated with the Hanbalis. Now, as prevalent as this notion is, by no means is it the full story. For whilst there is an absolutist anti-stance amongst Hanbalis, the historical truth of the matter is that there is also a pro-Kalam stance amongst the Hanbalis too. The anti-Kalam stance is best exemplified by Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, rahmatullah alayhi. He dies in the year 620. Okay, Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, a pillar of the madhab, who wrote a scathing tract against delving into any sort of kalam whatsoever. He wrote a book called a booklet called Tahrim al-Nadhr fi kutubi ahli al-kalam. Tahrim al-Nadhr, the prohibition of looking into the books of the Kalam people. And by Kalam people, he wasn't talking just about the Mu'tazilites. He was talking about anyone who ascribes to Sunni Islam. And he didn't just say that in one book. He has about 12 or 13 books. Not 12 or 13, I'm including his fiqh books. Maybe 7 or 8 books on Aqidah. And at least 2 of them mention a slightly anti-Ashari statement in them. Okay. So it's not, oh, this is Ibn Taymiyyah's anti-Kalam, but he doesn't really express proper Hanbalism. There's a truth in that. This is Ibn Qudama, Mr. Hanbali himself from the 7th century, and he and many like him were anti-Kalamists, scathingly anti-Kalam. And he took his anti-Kalam attitude from amongst other people. He has many teachers, but one of the teachers that he only had 40 days to study with before his teacher passed away was Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, radiallahu anhu. Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, through the Hanbali sources, we find that he was also very anti-Kalam. Ibn Qudama's anti-Kalam, it is said, was mild in comparison to Shaykh Abdul Qadir's. So that is something to think about. Anyway, so in the Hanbali school, the anti-Kalam sentiment is best exemplified by Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, a pillar of the madhab, who wrote a scathing tract against delving into any sort of Kalam, rebutting the Hanbali polymath Ibn Aqil for having done so. So that book, Tahrim al-Nadhr, he wrote against another famous Hanbali who died about half a century before him, called Ibn Aqil. Ibn Aqil was a famous Hanbali, but he went into some Kalam. So Ibn Qudama, Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's son, because Shaykh Abdul Qadir had passed away, and a few others, they all ganged up on Ibn Aqil and forced his repentance, okay, for delving into Kalam. So in it, Ibn Qudama wrote, with the usual characteristic hostility of a purist against Kalam, quote, this is a quote from his anti-Kalam book, Ibn Qudama, as for him, meaning Ibn Aqil, his faction consists of the people of Kalam, To speak of them is only to censure them, to warn against them, to cause people to flee from associating with them, to order abandoning and shunning them, and to abandon looking into their books, right? If you're going to speak about Ibn Aqil and other Kalam practitioners, you only do so to warn against them and to tell people that these people are misguided. That's all you do. You don't speak about them in any positive way. He then cites Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal and Ash-Shafi and Abu Yusuf in their rebuke of Kalam, and we've seen their statements of Kalam. And then he said, quote, and Ahmad ibn Ishaq al-Maliki declared, and this Ahmad ibn Ishaq al-Maliki is famously known as Ibn Khuways and Mandad. Ibn Khuways and Mandad, who was a Maliki scholar. Ibn Qudama quotes him saying, the people of innovation and desires, yani Ahlul Bida wal Hawa, or wal Ahwa, in the view of our Maliki colleagues and the people of Kalam, are the people of Kalam. So every person of Kalam is from the followers of false desires and innovations, be he an Ash'ari or not an Ash'ari. No testimony, no shahada or testimony of his should be accepted. He should be ostracized and punished for his innovation, and if he persists in it, his repentance should be sought. So that's basically Ibn Qudama and a large group of Hanbalis. Okay, so this anti-Kalam stance holds that there simply isn't anything reliable or decisive or authentic from Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal on the issue to render lawful the deployment of Kalam in whatever form. Okay, so that's a group of the Hanbalis. However, as we said, that's not the whole story. As for the pro-Kalam stance, then Ibn Hamdan is one of the great scholars of Usul al-Fiqh in the Hanbali school, but he also has a number of fiqh texts. He dies in the year 695. So about 70 years after Ibn Qudama, he dies. He's a famous Hanbali scholar. Ibn Hamdan, one of the leading Hanbali authorities of his age, said, and actually, let me just, so I've got his book here. It's a really nice book on Sifatul Fatwa. It's Mustafti. So he says, وَعِلْمُ الْكَلَامِ الْمَذْمُومِ وَهُوَ أُصُولُ الدِّينِ إِذَا تُكُلِّمَ فِيهِ بِالْمَعْقُولِ الْمَحَضِ أو المخالف للمنقول الصريح الصحيح. So he says the science of blameworthy kalam, ilmul kalam al-madhmum, is when the usuluddin, the fact that, which means the aqidah basically, when the articles of faith, usuluddin, are spoken of about using only aql, only reason, or contravening clear-cut textual proofs. فإن تكلم فيه بالنقل فقط أو بالنقل والعقل الموافق له فهو أصول الدين وطريقة أهل السنة وأهلها. But if it is spoken about using textual proofs alone, Quran and Hadith, for example, or textual proofs accompanied by reason which supports them, or rationale which supports them, then this is the true Usuluddin and the path of Ahl Sunnah and its adherents. So let's continue. Ibn Muflih, who is a scholar who dies in the 8th Islamic century, but he is a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Taymiyyah said about Ibn Muflih that he knows of no one who knows the Hanbali school, Hanbali fiqh, better than Ibn Muflih in his time. So Ibn Muflih says, who is one of the towering authorities of the school, he discussed the Hanbali school stance on Kalam at length. So after quoting an imposing salvo of reports from Imam Ahmad in terms of the Dhammul Kalam or censure of Kalam, then his pro-argument, Kalam arguments are made. So what he does in his book, he brings pages after pages, about 20, 30 pages, that go on through so many narrations where Imam Ahmad was against Kalam, or where some of Imam Ahmad's main students were against Kalam, and he quotes Imam Shafi and Abu Yusuf and all these other people. And so he makes the anti-kalam case first. And then after that, being, having insaf, having, a level of fairness, he makes the pro-kalam arguments of his school. And here in the pro-kalam arguments, Ibn Muflih quotes Ibn Abi Ya'la as saying that the correct stance in the madhab is that the science of ilmul kalam is prescribed and sanctioned. It's mashru'. And actually that saying of Ibn Abi Ya'la has now become, from probably the 9th Islamic century, if not the 8th Islamic century, the 9th Islamic century up until the 15th Islamic century, that has become the normative opinion of the Hanbali school, that ilmul kalam is prescribed if it's defending the Salafi Aqidah. So as to refute, is prescribed so as to refute the innovators. And then Ibn Muflih says, such was the opinion of a party of the muhaqqiqun of the Hanbali school, including Qadi Abu Ya'la and At-Tamimi. He noted how Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal himself wrote a booklet, a risala called Radd ala Zanadika wal Qadariyya, and it's in print even now, in which, we're quoting Ibn Muflih, in which he relied upon rational arguments to demolish the false ideas of the deviants. Ibn Abi Ya'la then says, what the earliest scholars held to of Imam Ahmad's words were abrogated. Ahmad said, as reported by Hanbal, we used to order silence, but when we were called to the affair, it was incumbent for us to defend it and clarify the matter. The affair being referred to was the Inquisition, the mihna, unleashed against those upon orthodox belief that the Quran is the uncreated word of Allah, and his defense of it by using rational-based arguments, in other words, kalam. Ibn Muflih, quoting Ibn Abi Ya'la, says, yes, it is true Imam Ahmad was harsh against it at the beginning, but when it came to the Inquisition and he had to refute the Mu'tazilites on their own term, he used some kalam. But the type of kalam Imam Ahmad uses is quite different than the level of kalam that the Ash'aris go into, and their foundations of kalam is not something that you find in Hanbali kalam. I mean, you do find it, but not as much. But that's just an academic point. Now, point 11. Now, whether Imam Ahmad's latter words abrogate his earlier ones, or whether it's just a case of contextualizing the Imam's words, is an area of disagreement amongst pro-kalam Hanbali scholars. All it's saying is, were Imam Ahmad's earlier words abrogated? So is it a matter of nasikh and mansukh, or is it a matter of jam? That actually there was no abrogation. It's just that in some situations Imam Ahmad says no, in some situations he says yes, and you just have to make jam. You must just harmonize his words. It's just an academic issue here. For whilst a group of them, such as Ibn Abi Ya'la, held to the view of abrogation, others held to the more preferable view of jam, of harmonization. This is the stance which holds that Imam Ahmad employed kalam arguments when he believed there was a need, and refrained from it when he believed there was no need. Now, having cited the above words of Ibn Hamdan, Imam al-Bahuti he's a bit like Ibn Abidin, although he's like a few hundred years before Ibn Abidin. How the Hanafis hold Ibn Abidin, many of the Hanabila hold al-Bahuti, but al-Bahuti tends to be, for a lot of Hanbalis, the last word on the matter, or at least his texts, his matun are the last word on the matter. So al-Bahuti states, the statement of Ibn Hamdan is like a harmonization between the two views of forbiddance or allowance, and this is preferable over abrogation. What supports this is the report from al-Marrudi that Imam Ahmad said, I am not a person of kalam. I do not view kalam in anything except if it be in the book of Allah and the hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or from any of his companions, may Allah be pleased with him, or one of the tabi'un. As for other than these, then speech concerning it is not praiseworthy, related by Abu Bakr al-Khallam. In other words, whatever stands in opposition to the conclusion of the book and the Sunnah or a Salaf report, even if it appears to be rationally justifiable, is blameworthy. Imam Ahmad didn't like, according to these Hanbalis, he didn't like the new invented language. If he was going to do rational proofs, he liked to use the language of revelation itself. And he liked to argue in the style of how the Quran argues its case. And it's okay to expand upon that. But as regards to using what has become standard kalam terminology of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, taking it from the Mu'tazilites and then Sunnifying it, the Hanbalis say that Imam Ahmad didn't like that and will try to avoid that, unless, of course, you can clearly clarify your terms and they have no shadiness in them. So that's the Hanbalis. The Hanbali Mu'tamad position by the Hanbali scholars who write our books of fiqh, our mutun of fiqh, they have the Mu'tamad position that kalam is mashru, is prescribed in Islam for the reasons mentioned.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh, mashallah. We're just on time. So inshallah ta'ala, we make the close now. So hopefully next week there's a break and the following week we start again. I would suggest that if brothers can read up to here from the article, which will be inshallah ta'ala sent to you. It'd be good to just have a bit of, review of the previous slides if you haven't gone through previous lectures. So inshallah they'll be a bit more ready for we will come to Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhi's view and also Salafi, modern Salafi's view as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Inshallah ta'ala, because you have to be a bit more clued up with the stuff that we've just tackled so far, so as to get the difference from the Barakallah. Shaykh, go on.
No, Barakallah fikum, Dr. Salim. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So when we do Ibn Taymiyyah, we'll see how we'll see his unique position, which is not kind of Ash'ari, nor is it quite Hanbali. It's something else, but it's taken by the Salafis of today. The Salafis of today generally hold to Ibn Taymiyyah with an exception. Ibn Taymiyyah was intellectually deep. It's hard pressed to find any serious Salafi scholar who has the level of rational intellectual depth that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah had. But what is common amongst all Salafis is, yep, kalam is haram, and you're a deviant, and so on and so forth. And Ibn Taymiyyah didn't quite have that stance. So he didn't have an Ibn Qudama stance, but he didn't quite have an Ibn Mufli or a Qadi Abu Ya'la stance. He was a law unto himself. So if we deal with that, and some of the objections he raises, we then get into some kalam issues. Okay, and then we can flesh it out. And if you are like me, you will not enjoy this. But if you love kalam, you might enjoy this. Okay, this is like giving a Pakistani or a Bengali some biryani, but there's no spices in it at all. He knows he'll benefit from the protein and the starch and the carbohydrates, but there's no maza in it. Okay, this is, if you're like me, this is what's going to happen next.
جزاك الله خيرا ما شاء الله سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام.